Okay, so do you want to just say for the refuah for the Yehuda Yitzchak ben Miriam?
Perfect, thank you.
And other chulim.
Absolutely.
Okay, so continuing in the theme of davening, there was something else. No, I just lost. Sorry, I lost the place for a sec. Okay, tachanun. Okay, so tachanun is what you call, translated loosely into English, means submission, or there's another word for it. Anyway, it's a submission. So Ashkenazim put their head on their arm, and Sephardim don't. And you only do tachanun if there's a Sefer Torah present. You can daven tachanun. You can't say tachanun by yourself, but you mustn't put your head down. If you're davening at home, you can still say it, but you can't put your head, rest your head on your arm. It can only be if there's a Sefer Torah around. I don't know if you guys knew that.
I didn't know that.
Gavin, did you know that?
No, I don't know much though.
Arthur knows that.
Arthur knows everything.
So that's a submission. It's like it's formed like in Israel. What they do here, which you don't do in South Africa, just before Tachanun, they do the Hashavnu. They do that every day. Hashavnu. Then you do the 13 attributes, and you also do every day. And every Chazarat Hashat, which is the repetition, is Birkat Kohanim. Every day in Shachrit, Birkat Kohanim. You only do it in the Chagim in South Africa. Birkat, so it's every day, Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos, every day. 7 days a week is Birkat Kohanim. Unless there's no Kohanim, then you, which is very, which I don't know.
You're always
Birkat Kohanim. So that's it. So the Tachanun, so that's it. So just if you're doing it on your own, you don't put your head down.
Okay.
Unless you happen to have a personal Sefer Torah, which costs a couple of $100,000, which 99% of us don't have in our private homes.
So you're saying when you do that, I didn't hear everything. So you're saying when you're doing tachanun at home, you don't put your head down.
Unless you have a Sefer. Do you have a Sefer Torah, okay?
I have a Torah that's safe, yeah. I have a Torah and I have a safe.
I'll tell you a joke about that. Arthur, listen to this. When I was a reservist, we took over the Sandringham police station on Xmas Day for the non-Jewish permanent force officers. And I went with this other guy. We met this guy at Yeshiva College Shul. He was davening Shachrit in his police uniform with his bulletproof vest on. It was a Thursday morning, and we arrived just before Torah reading. And he said to us, now we have a Sefer Torah, because there were 3 cops there.
Very clever.
Well, I'm still trying to save for a Torah, so.
Yeah. S-A-F-E-R, not S-E-F-E-R.
I'm going to share my screen for a new Mishnah that we're dealing with now. Guys, give me 1 second. And I want the Honorable Arthur to read for us.
Okay, Mishnah. Can you do this? Ken's beside. No. Sorry, man.
Okay. Gavin, you read, because Arthur needs to attend to his client, his patient.
Perfect. If one sends a fire and it consumes the wood, stones, or earth of another, he is liable to pay compensation, because it is stated, if a fire shall go forth and find thorns and a stack of grain, or the standing grain, or the field is consumed, the one who kindled the blaze shall surely pay.
Excellent. So that's in Shemot chapter 22, verse 4 in Exodus. And when it uses the word sadeh, the field, it refers to the field surface itself. It's not talking about the produce on top. That's a given. Here it's actually talking about the surface. So if you've plowed already and the earth becomes dry and scorched and the stones, etc., in that particular case, you would have to replow the field because of the lack of hydration. So it's talking about that particular cost involved. And that's a commentary from Rashi. Now, when it says the fire blackened the stones, I actually don't know what it means. I'm not a farmer. I don't know what stones with soot would cost the owner, or what it actually means. I'm just being straight with you guys. So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing the screen now at this point. Okay, and I'm going to put Arthur on mute, but Arthur's still with me. Give me a second. All right. So, the Gemara is going to examine this Mishnah, and Rava said, why do I need the merciful one to write in his Torah, thorns, stacks of grain, standing grain, and field? In other words, what's the purpose of each term? Because, if you look at just the plain meaning of the Mishnah, if the fire caught onto the thorns and it spread to the stack of grain or the standing grain, etc. But if you look at the Gemara in deep analysis, it's not saying that it's talking about a case where fire spreads and just consumes a whole lot of things. It's saying that it burnt either the thorns or the grain. So we're talking about a case of having liability, not for everything, but if it specifically burns one thing. And what's the purpose of each term? They're all necessary, because if the merciful one had written only thorns, I would have said that there's only when one's fire burns thorns that the merciful one imposes liability, because fire is often found among thorns. So Rav is basically saying, look, if Hashem had written only thorns, I would have thought that there is liability as far as that's concerned, because fire is found among thorns, because thorns are dry and liable to be flammable and catch and spread. So it would be typical that one would be negligent in regard to them. And what does that mean? Is that if people aren't careful to keep a fire away from thorns, because they're burned in any event, maybe you would have consequently assumed that those who burn the thorns of another were negligent. So that's logical. But if your fire burnt a stack of grain where fire isn't usually found, in other words, it's not flammable, and it's not something like in a dry bushel would catch a light, and because of the unusual nature that one would be negligent, I would have said that he is not liable. So Rav is coming to say, I can understand in thorns where it's an accident waiting to happen, but as far as a stack of grain is concerned, it's unusual. So therefore, it's not an indication of negligence at all. Guys, if I become unstable, can you hear me? I don't mean mentally unstable, that I had lost you.
The audio is good, but the picture's not, like in slow motion.
Sorry, guys.
That's not so serious. As long as the audio is fine, it's going to be fine.
Yeah, the audio is fine.
Often the two go together. It's normally both. Then that's a problem. So you can continue. It's fine.
Okay. So Rashi's view, Gavin, on Rava is that we can basically say it's unlikely a person would allow his fire to burn a stack of grain, because it's worth a lot of money. It's not like some thorn bush. And therefore, if that did happen, it was an unavoidable accident. And therefore, you might have thought that that person isn't liable. So therefore, the verse had to add a stack of grain to include liability in such a case. That's the opinion of Rava. And it said you also need the word thorns, because if the merciful one had only written a stack of grain, I would have said that where a fire burns a stack of grain, maybe the merciful one would obviously impose liability there, because it's a substantial loss financially. But thorns, where the loss is small, I would have said that you're not liable. Now, we're not talking about a case when a person directly ignites somebody's property, because then there's no question that there's liability. We're saying that the fire spread from your premises to your neighbors. And the thorn bush isn't very expensive, so you might have thought that the person would have been on the hook. The term is what, guys? Off the hook, actually. Sorry. Off the hook, yeah. Off the hook for the thorn bushes, because they catch easily and they're not worth a lot of money. So the Mishnah had to include the word thorns to say that even if the cost is insignificant, you're out for that. So in other words, Rava has two arguments. If you would have come to think that for a stack of grain you would have been off the hook because it's a substantial loss, and it's very unlikely that it would just suddenly catch fire because it's not prone to it because the area around it is dry and it's generally not flammable, and on that basis you're off the hook. The Mishnah then mentions a stack of grain. If you think you're off the hook for thorns because it doesn't cost a lot, the Mishnah mentions the thorns to show you still have to pay even if the cost isn't substantial. So it's covering you on either case. So why is the verse standing grain separate to normal grain? Okay. So Rava says it says yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You froze for about 10 seconds.
No, it's fine, but we didn't miss anything. You can. I don't think so. You can continue.
Well,
you did freeze.
I wish the directors of MTN happy health.
I thought you might.
Yeah. So look, you've got three things in the Mishnah, Kevin. You've got normal grain, you've got thorns, and you've got standing grain. So it says, why mention standing grain separately? What's the point? Why don't you just put it under grain? Because it serves to teach the following law. Just as standing grain is exposed, so too everything else must be exposed if you're to be liable for damaging it with fire. In other words, normal grain can be stacked like bags of flour, etc., at ground level. Standing grain means it's still in the field at the time, meaning it hasn't been harvested, which means you're liable for that. But then why mention the word standing? Because we know that anything that is visually exposed, you have to pay for. And then what is the implication? Guys, what is inferred? If I say to you things that are exposed are paid for, what is the implication?
That hidden stuff is not, you don't have to pay for it.
It's no liability.
Exactly. So that was that discussion in 3b with Rabbi Yehuda and the sages. So exactly. So we said that you learn from there that fire damage is only liability for something that was exposed, but anything concealed, you don't pay for. So in other words, if you've got a Picasso hidden in one's haystack and you make a claim for it, they're not going to pay out. Utensils, etc. All right. So how does Rabbi Yehuda answer that? Because what does Rabbi Yehuda rule, guys? Guys, we've done this. What does Rabbi Yehuda rule?
That you pay for stuff that's
Concealed.
That you can see.
No, that's obvious. They all do.
Oh yes, I remember. He says you do pay. No, he says you do pay for concealed items.
That's correct. So everybody agrees that you pay for items that are exposed from the verse of standing grain. But as far as concealed items are concerned, the sages say there's no liability because I could claim anything was concealed in the fire. Rabbi Yehuda says you do have to pay. So how would he answer this question? He rules that one is liable for damage to concealed items caused by fire. In other words, why do I need the Torah to mention standing grain? Because Rabbi Yehuda has to answer this Mishnah. What does he derive from that meaning? So the Gemara answers that Rabbi Yehuda needs to include anything that possesses stature, meaning that animals and trees in other words, anything that stands, you have to cover. Anything that's above leg height, you have to cover. It's not just the actual field itself. Because you might have also come to think that there's no liability in the case of animals because an animal can escape. So we learn from this that even animals need to be covered, even though they're able to escape. Now, it's going to ask the obvious question. So then where do the sages see that you have to cover for animals and trees, etc.? In other words, how do they derive the halacha? Rav Yehuda said we derive the halacha from standing grain. Where do the sages derive it from? From the fact that it uses the word or. Not or as in light, but either or. In other words, you have to sort out, as we said, standing grain or thorns or a stack of grain, etc., or a field that is consumed. So when it mentions the term or, it's coming to include anything that possesses stature. Meaning from there we learn that even things that are not indigenous to that particular area, like agricultural fields, but rather trees or animals are covered. And then it's going to ask that question back to Rabbi Yehuda. So what does Rabbi Yehuda see the word or as meaning? In other words, alternatives. How does he interpret it? He needs it to basically divide the items listed in the verse. In other words, to teach that liability is imposed not only when your fire burns all the listed items, but even when it burns one of them. So, in other words, the term or means it doesn't have to be the word and. And means it's inclusive of everything. Or means if it burns one of them, you're covered for liability. Does that make sense? Then the Gemara asks again, well, then how do the rabbis determine that, for example, it covers individual items? In other words, what's the divisionary term that the rabbis use? So they say, look, Rabbi Yehuda used the word or because it said all the standing grain, all the field, whereas the rabbis derive it from the word or that precedes the field. So in other words, the bottom line of the argument is as follows, is that there's more than one word saying or, meaning you have choices. And the minute you have choices, it means you can be selective of coverage of damage. So the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda have just used different versions of the word or in your list to derive the same sort of concept. So what's this backwards and forwards? Each of the opinions of the sages need to cover themselves, and Rabbi Yehuda needs to have rules in place to be able to determine the halacha. So all this Mishnah is doing in the Gemara is showing where they both get their sourcing from. And that when the one sourcing is taken by the sages, Rabbi Yehuda has to find another sourcing to validate his claims and vice versa. Okay? In certain cases, they can agree. But if the sages have used a word to explain a concept, it's obviously going to ask Rabbi Yehuda, well, how do you derive the halacha if that word is used by the sages and you're using some other word or some other concept? So it's this backwards and forwards. All right? So, in other words, it also asks Rabbi Yehuda, since the word or was used by the sages in one regard, like the standing grain, if the merciful one wrote or the standing grain, why do you take it from the word or the field? And the answer to that is very straightforward. It's just for stylistic consistency. That's all it is. Okay. Now it's going on to another topic. All it wanted to know is that both Rabbi Yehuda and the sages have an explanation. So having explained why the Torah says thorns, stack of grain, or standing grain, Rava explains why it always mentions the word field. So what do you need the word field for? So it comes to include liability for a field that has already been plowed or singed with stones. In other words, there are two parts to a field. Gavin, the one part of the field is actually the produce from the field, and the other part is the ground itself. So you might have thought that if the ground had remained desolate but was harvested, you haven't lost any value. But if the ground was depleted of nutrients because it was scorched or depleted of, moisture, and it had to be replowed, that's the damager's fault. Scorched stones, I don't get it. I'm not a farmer. Maybe Arthur knows. Arthur, what's the coverage there for?
Well, if you scorch stones, they go black and they're not nice to walk on. Depends if you're talking about slates on the ground.
Okay.
If you're talking about a rock, you could crack a rock. Okay, which could damage a wall or whatever. Because remember, the walls are made of rock. I'm just guessing here. The walls are made of rock, and if you hit against the water, it can actually damage the infrastructure of the wall. It was near a wall.
Okay, that's not a bad point. I think that That makes sense to me. I'm happy with
If
that.
something gets scorched, it loses its value. I mean, I suppose like rock had value then. I mean, we are talking about Flintstone times. I mean,
Yeah, that's true. All right, so the Gemara basically said that other items are necessary because if the merciful one had written only field, I would have said that if a fire damaged what is in the field, in other words, the produce, he's liable, but if it damaged something else, the ground itself, he's not liable. So therefore, the Torah informed us by mentioning the standing grain that field in this context refers not to the produce, but the ground itself. Okay? And that's the explanation given by Rashi or Rashba. So now we're going to just learn one other thing. So we're going to go to a bit of a gadata.
I was just thinking also.
Yeah. Yeah, mate.
With the rock thing also, it could also be maybe like they meant by like a rock table, because in those days you used to make things not out of just wood, but out of like rock. Okay, so it could be a marble table that can be classed as a rock. I mean, it's not exactly, I'm just anything made out of rock which can crack. Because a regular rock won't crack, but a marble, if it's something like that, that's sensitive to heat, can break.
Yeah, but I think you're right. Even if
I'm
it
just
doesn't
guessing.
break, you
I
probably
wasn't there in the Flintstones.
you do probably have to clean it so it's aesthetically pleasing, especially if rocks were used for certain other functional tools. Probably it's correct. So let's just go on to an Agadic teaching. So Gavin likes Agadita. I know when we learn in Gemara and we do Agadita, it's like stories.
They probably use the rock for decorations as well, Dan. No, like they use rock for decorations.
Yeah,
They might have had a rock pool there. They might have had like a rock pool that could damage a whole thing. Give me an example.
Yeah, probably. All right, so guys, we're going to do a bit of a gadata. Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani said in the name of Rav Yonasan, tribulation visits the world only when the wicked are in the world, but it initiates upon the righteous first. Okay, as it says, if a fire shall go forth and find thorns, when a fire, in other words, what's a fire known as tribulation, tests, go forth, when thorns are an analogy for wicked people, are available to it, but it initiates only with the righteous first, as it says in the same verse, and a stack of grain. So the stack of grain is known as righteous. Why do you think righteous people are known as a stack of grain? Guys,
Because they stand against the wind. A stack or standing?
Well, firstly, I think Kevin's got a good point, because we're going to learn later on that the term standing grain, if you say somebody's of good standing, what's the term mean? What's the term mean? It means that they've got a good reputation.
They're not swayed. They're not swayed by
now we know that
things. They stand their ground.
Industry, because when somebody's not standing, they're unhealthy. When it means it with normal people, Arthur, you need to work with the younger people too. What it means is if you've got a standing ovation or you have a person of good standing, it means on a serious note that they're worth standing up for. They're noteworthy. They stand out because of their contribution, their abilities. Now, thorns are cut and they prevent growth. Then nothing grows on them, and they're used many times as fences to try and injure if you trespass. So thorns are known as an obstruction, which is a term for the wicked, and standing grain. It uses the term grain, even a stack of grain, Kevin, because grain is okay. So let me just define something here. When they're using the term standard grain, they're talking about the leaders of the generation. There is a term for that. So they analogously are known as the leaders of the generation. Your average religious Jew that is Shomrei mitzvahs and is a good person and goes to shul and daven and works is known as not standing grain but a stack of grain, meaning he might look like the same as any other person. But the point of it is he's dedicated his life to serving Hashem, but he's not going to be Rav Shach necessarily. So, Kev, you falling asleep?
No.
Okay, your eyes are closing. So what I'm saying is as follows,
No.
is that there's two different...
Just looking up.
there's just two different versions. In other words, the leaders of the generation are known as standing grain, and your average Jew, which is not average by world standards at all, somebody that dedicates their life to moral compass, observant, avodah, service, mitzvahs, chesed, etc., is exceptional amongst other human beings, but leads an ordinary life. In other words, if you look at him, he's a member of a community. He's a contributing member. And all those contributing members make a society. But it's not standing out amongst his people. Do you see the difference between a stack of grain and standing grain in the analogy that they use? Also, grain is useful. Grain feeds, it's produce, it keeps you alive. And the world is kept alive because of tzaddikim, not because of the Rishonim. I can tell you that much. They get a free ride in this world. So what it's saying is here.
Damon?
Yeah.
You see, the difference is when they can't stand, so I make them upstanding.
You stand up for them, Arthur.
Yeah, I help them up and they stand. Because they can't stand themselves, so I can stand, so I stand for them.
I say, Arthur, not only are you upstanding, but you're outstanding. Let's go on. Let's cover some ground.
Yeah, we actually go out quite often, yeah.
Yeah. We need to cover some ground because that's where the grain comes from. All right, let's get back to it, guys. So anyway, Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani said in the name of Rav Yochanan, tribulation visits the world only when the wicked are in the world, but it initiates upon the righteous first. As it says, if a fire shall go forth and find thorns, when does a fire, in other words, test, tribulations, punishments go forth? Thorns, the wicked are available to it, meaning that nothing would catch a light if there were no sin in the world. In other words, the world wouldn't be put through COVID if everybody was a tzaddik. I can tell you that much. So when thorns, the wicked are available for it, but when it initiates only with the righteous first, as it says in the same verse, in a stack of grain, in other words, the group of the righteous is consumed. It doesn't say, and the fire consumes a stack of grain, but rather, and a stack of grain is consumed. If you look at the syntax, the order, meaning that the stack of grain is already consumed by the time the fire reaches the thorns. So let me just put this in a plain English, and I got this from the Or HaChaim, is that the wicked are compared to thorns. Why? Because a thorn serves no positive purpose and are tinder for the flames. The righteous who live productive lives are compared to a stack of produce. That's according to the Mahasha. So the verse mentions three items that are consumed. A stack of grain, which we said are the tzaddikim because they're
Damon, you need to go back 20 seconds.
Damon,
you froze.
About a minute. You were sitting there not doing anything.
Okay, it sounds like
audio and video.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, there was nothing there.
All right, just bottom.
That's your fault. It's MTM.
All right, so give me a chance just to cover some ground. Again, wicked compared to thorns, no productive purpose. They actually, the reason that flames can spread is because it's only because of their wickedness that tribulations come in the world. The righteous are compared to grain because produce is productive, it keeps people alive. It's according to the Mahasha. There's two things: a stack of grain or the righteous. Standing grain or the righteous of the generation because they stand out amongst the crowd. A stack of grain is as productive and feeds others, but it's homogeneous. It's just one of the many members of the community that make the world successful. And the field where the stack of grain developed refers to the sinless children who study Torah before their teachers, who have not yet reached stature. Okay, so that's on the Or HaChaim. Just one thing. It does mention here that it doesn't mean necessarily that even righteous people who are entirely free of sin are also invited by tribulation. It just says that the righteous are consumed first. It's not talking about guys completely righteous people. What do you think it's talking about?
Righteous in their generation.
Yeah, not perfect people.
Like Noah.
In other words, well, you only have a couple of people in the world that have never really sinned. But most people, they're known as righteous if they do more good deeds compared to bad. In other words, they'll tip the scale in their favor, but nobody's perfect, and therefore tribulations will visit them so that they pay for their sins in this world rather than the next world. But people that are completely righteous are escaping, except sometimes if they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, they can be swept up by the current. I remember reading Brochus in the beginning of learning Daf Yomi in 5a, where it says that if a tzaddik messes with a gangster, he could end up getting bullet fodder and not being saved. You know, because if a tzaddik and a Rosh jump off a building, gravity is going to splat them both. So in other words, there is an opinion in Gemara Brochas that you need to stay away from bad areas. Give me an example in the Chumash. Arthur, you give me an example. This is a very famous one.
Bad area. Okay. If Arthur doesn't go, then Gal do it.
Hey, what? I just got distracted. What's our remain? I'm just looking at my client. What?
I'm saying, all right, Kevin, you give it. It's not a problem.
Sodom.
The perfect example. That's exactly. Abraham said they're bad people to Lot. Lot said, I want to go down because he wanted the money. And Sodom was destroyed. So even if somebody is righteous, if you live among wicked people, you could get swept up in the current. But the one thing to remember that it brings from the Ian Yaakov is that if the righteous had a couple of paltry sins, nothing major, they wouldn't have warranted on their own the emergence of a sweeping fire. Meaning that something like COVID wouldn't have occurred if you didn't have thousands of people on Tinder a day. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, think of this. Tinder is a case where people are hopping from place to place. Let's put it that way in clean terms. And what would stop people from getting involved? Well, it was a spread of HIV at a certain point. And then people decided to wear contraception. Now you're getting a deathly virus by just physical contact. So think about it. If nobody was sinning and everybody behaved themselves, do you think there might be COVID? I'm just giving you food for thought.
But they could stand on Tinder boxes. That's okay.
Yeah, well, it's called Tinder because it's like a flame, like what we're learning now.
David, so a quick question. Okay, so the righteous are people that are doing good, and the leftists are?
Only.
That's actually very funny. Arthur Gavin would appreciate it. So
No, I love that. I was trying to say it earlier, but I didn't want to say anything because we're recording. But Arthur's already said it. Well done.
Awesome.
Yeah, I don't know what to say to that, but it makes
Stop recording and recording. Join.
Okay, so how long have we got left? Okay, guys, let's just cover a little bit of ground quickly because I've had some interruptions. Rav Yosef taught in the Brisa, what's the meaning of that which is written in regard to the night? The firstborn of Egypt were struck dead. And as for you, the Jews, you shall not leave the entrance of the house until morning. Why were the Jews not permitted to go out of Egypt at night? Guys?
What was the question? I couldn't hear you correctly.
In Mitzrayim.
Why would they have supposed to leave at night?
No, I'm saying you had the plague of the firstborn. If the Jews were
It happened
righteous,
at night.
Okay, but what I'm
It's
saying...
dangerous. Nighttime is dangerous. That's why. Isn't the nighttime a dangerous time?
Yes,
Because the angel of death operates, so...
Hang on.
Because it was the thing of death.
Dark forces.
Okay, so three of you at once, but I like the enthusiasm. So let's just say that, Kevin, there are two reasons, and I think Gavin mentioned and Arthur interjected, is that reason number one is that once a seed of destruction goes out, it doesn't matter if you're righteous, you could be you could be a casualty of war. That's what the Bryce is actually. That's what Rav Yosef is teaching, is that don't think because you're Yid and the rest are Mitzrim, that all of a sudden, if is this force of destruction, that you're going to remain unscathed because you're a tzaddik. You've got to avoid that area completely.
It's in this week's parsha, actually.
Exactly.
Hashem told the Jewish people to stay indoors during that plague. He told them they must stay indoors; they mustn't go outdoors.
Correct. But then there's an obvious question to that, okay? Because obviously what you're saying is right. Once you've got the force of destruction and it's been given authority to wreak havoc and damage, it's not going to distinguish between righteous and wicked. So the Jews would have been endangered if they left their homes. But there's obviously a question. And that question is, who was it, a malach that killed the firstborn?
Yes.
What did you say, Gavin?
Hashem.
And therefore?
No malach.
Agent was a malach.
No.
I don't think it was a malach.
Gavin's 100% correct. It said, I and no other shall redeem Egypt, and I will smite the firstborn. So, what that basically means is, the question on this is, I understand if you're in Phuket and there's a tsunami because you've got wicked people that kill animals while they're still alive to eat them and do cruelty and avoid Azora and everything else, and there's a flood or whatever, that's fine. You're caught there. You're an average guy in the 21st century, and you're not worthy of open miracles. Not you guys. I'm sure you guys are, but let's just say the average Joe. Righteous, good guy, but he's amongst bad people, and he gets caught up in it. The seas are not suddenly going to part for him. But here it's saying something different. And that question is, Hashem is a genius. Hashem can determine who's righteous and who's wicked. It's not like you're setting in force a destructive impediment, and it'll take casualties of war. Hashem removed the firstborn. So why wouldn't he be able to discern between Jew and Egyptian? That's the question to this bracer.
No, absolutely Hashem can, but the thing is, Hashem's warning you, if there's just be careful. This is a life lesson. It's not just for that specific purpose. I mean, it's for any time. You can't take matters into your own hand and think because you're such a tzaddik or you're such a righteous yid or you're a frum yid or whatever, even an average yid who has a connection with Hashem, and you think that you can bypass what's happening in the world,
Okay, so what Gavin's saying is whatever we learn in the Chumash are general instructions of how to apply in situations, and this is an instructional motif in terms of how to go forward as a general principle. So the question is, you can learn this from other things. You can learn this specifically. You don't need this, Gavin. All you need to do is you can learn this from Sodom, even more clearer than here. Because there's Sodom, there were two malachim that were dispatched to get rid of Sodom. And Lot's wife turned around to look and didn't make it. And Lot only made it because he was pulled out by Abraham. So therefore, you've got that instruction earlier on. You don't need this. You don't need this. This is a different case. This is a case where it said, I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night. I and no angel, I will slay the first. No, Gavin, this is this is a legitimate argument. In other words, you don't need that instruction. And the Rashi brings this as a question in the Haggadah that it's a legitimate question. In other words, you could have learned that from Lot, that you shouldn't be in a place of danger. It's different to when Hashem, and this was the only case when Hashem pulled them out directly. So what it was saying is some of the commentaries in the case of Haggadah.
That's what I'm saying. That's the difference.
Yeah, but I'm saying you can get that instruction in an earlier place in the Chumash. You don't need it twice. So what it was saying here is some of the commentaries on the Haggadah is it specifically at night when it's a time of din, judgment, because they were on the 49th level of Tumah. You've got to bear in mind, they were rescued out of there. They weren't on such a righteous level. They were rescued. So who's to say they would have survived it? In other words, now time was a time of judgment. Specifically, you said by Imunatcha, you're doing Ma'arif, and they're in the 49th level. And that alone means that they were almost at destruction level. So they weren't holding at a level where they had a lot of merits to have open miracles necessarily. Do you see what I'm saying?